key appears out of nowhere. Burn barrels, nobody can seem to keep track of. And we may finally get to the cross-examination that puts the state's lead investigator on the defensive. Hello and welcome to the Beach House 34 True Crime and Paranormal podcast. Over the past few weeks, we've been diving into the Stephen Avery trial, and today we'll hear part 2 of Agent Fassbender's testimony. As a reminder, if you like this content, subscribe wherever you listen, or if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button as well. It helps these videos get seen by more people. And thank you for that. I appreciate it. In part 1, episode 18, we learned about who Special Agent Fassbender was and how he related to this investigation. We heard about who was assigned to do what, how Stephen's house had been searched multiple times, but, on the last search, they found a key, which miraculously seemed to fit Teresa's RAV4. We learned that all the burn barrels were taken and that one of them ended up getting lost. We learned about license plates being found inside a vehicle on the property, and not just any license plates, but Teresa's license plates. In part 2, we pick up right where we left off. Everyone had been excused for the lunch break, and the state wasn't quite done with their questioning of this witness. So let's begin, shall we? So everyone has now come back from lunch. The jury is present. Everybody's present in the courtroom. And the court says, Mr. Kratz, at this time, you may resume your direct examination of the witness. And Attorney Kratz says, thank you, Your Honor, and his direct examination is continued. Agent Fassbender, we left off talking about the last 3 or 4 days of the search, bringing us to the 12th of November. On the 12th of November, how was this scene returned to the Avery family? I met with Charles Avery, and I believe Barb Janda was also present, and it was turned over to Charles. Between the 5th and the 12th of November, had you received requests from Avery family members to retrieve some personal belongings within the salvage yard and the residences? Yes, we had quite a few requests, and actually contacts with the Avery family members. They had pets or animals on the scene, medicine, I believe, mail on one occasion, where we had Barb Janda come in and get some mail. We were dealing, both Investigator Wiegert and myself, with them consistently. Were attempts made, when at all practical, to meet those needs, whether for business or personal reasons? Yes, I understand that we had their homes, their businesses for a week. And I understand that it is an extreme hardship. I have empathy for that. When we go to these scenes, we try to process them as quickly as possible because of that. The last area of inquiry, Agent Fassbender, you mentioned limiting access to the scene itself from the outside, that is, from citizens, or at least knowing who was on that property. Did you testify about that? Did I? Yes. Was there a method created to ensure that you could keep track of that kind of information? Yes. Logs are created on crime scenes such as this to record officers, law enforcement personnel, or whoever else, whether it be a coroner, whoever, that comes into the scene. In fact, when I got there on Saturday, ultimately, I got down by the car crusher, that staging area down there, and about 2:25, I think it was. And the officers that were staged there, I told them I recommended that they start a log there also. Was that done to your knowledge? I believe so. And do you know about what time a log was started for entry on to the Avery property? I'm not sure. Again, about what time was it that you arrived? About 2 o'clock. And was a log begun yet at that time? I believe so, but I just don't recall. That would have been somebody else's area of involvement or decision. Is that right? Yes, sir. Attorney Kratz then says, Judge, I would move the admission of Exhibits 130 through 138 at this time. The court says, any objection? Attorney Buting says none. And the court says, very well, those exhibits are admitted. Attorney Kratz then says, that's all I have of this witness. Thank you. The court then says, Mr. Buting, again, obviously one of Stephen's attorneys. And Attorney Buting says, yes, Judge, and his cross-examination begins. Good afternoon, Mr. Fassbender. Good afternoon. Let me go back to the beginning of your testimony about some of your experience for a few minutes, okay? Yes. 27 years as a law enforcement officer is a long time. Would you agree? Yes. Not that you are old yet, but it's a lot of experience. And I'm not sure that we got clear. Was all of that with DCI? 5 years of that was with the State Patrol. Okay. But always for the state, pretty much? Correct. And you did say that one of the functions of DCI is to help out other law enforcement departments all over the state, particularly smaller ones that may not have as many detectives, right? Certainly. And coming from outside of an area, you kind of have a different perspective, perhaps than the local people who have been, in individual local departments. Yes, possibly. I mean, you are somewhat at a disadvantage when you talked about knowing local vendors and resources if you needed tow trucks and that sort of thing, right? Yes. So it's helpful to have those local departments available for that kind of assistance. Certainly. Yes, sir. Okay. But in smaller departments, sometimes, you realize that there's probably some history between certain suspects and certain police departments. Certainly that could be. Okay. You have the advantage of, though, coming on scene without that kind of problem. You don't have any prior history with anybody who may be a suspect or a person of interest, right? Yes, I like to think so. And in this case, when you were called in, you live in the Fox Cities area? Correct. Okay. So you watch the television stations from Green Bay, and that's where you get most of your media news? Yes, sir. And Appleton News, of course. So you knew this Teresa Halbach case, missing person case, had already gotten quite a bit of publicity, right? I had seen bits and pieces. Yes. Okay. And when you were called into this case, you knew that this was going to be pretty high profile. Would that be fair? Just based on Teresa missing or where I was being sent? Where you were being sent? The possibility, yes, existed. Okay. So you knew that your performance as an officer, you didn't at that point know you would be a lead investigator, did you? No. But you knew that, obviously, your performance could be under the microscope, so to speak, of a high-profile case. My performance is always under a microscope, but more people may see it. Yes. Okay, sure. So you wanted to make sure that it was a thorough investigation that you undertook, right? Yes. As complete an investigation as you could. Yes. And as you described it, this funnel approach, you wanted to be as thorough and get all leads and everything carefully investigated before you narrowed down to the bottom of that funnel, that one man, right? Generally, yes. Okay. Now, you also knew, well, maybe you didn't. Did you know before you got assigned to the case and you went over to the Avery property, were you aware of who Mr. Avery, who he was? Yes. You knew about the wrongful conviction and all the years in prison and all of that, right? Yes. And you knew that he had filed a lawsuit against Manitowoc County after that, right? I believe so. Well, was there talk in the law enforcement community in this whole area, northeastern Wisconsin, about this lawsuit at all? No, not from my experience. Okay. So what you knew was not insider knowledge. It was just from the news? Essentially, I know DCI looked at something related to that. In fact, the Attorney General commissioned a report by your department. Yeah, the Attorney General. Okay. And she looked and focused on the wrongful conviction of Mr. Avery to try and see what, if anything, went wrong that could be determined. Although I wasn't involved in that, I believe so. Okay. And you knew then that after all that was done and all the information was gathered and additional facts were learned, Mr. Avery filed a lawsuit against Manitowoc County. Yes, I believe so. And against Manitowoc County Sheriff or former sheriff. I'm not sure about that. I know it was Manitowoc County. I believe Manitowoc Sheriff too. Yes. Okay, all right. And then you arrive with that background and that knowledge and you come to the scene, and the first thing you do is you go to the command post, which is right at the entranceway to the Avery property, right? Yes, sir. And you go through a debriefing, or a briefing, I should say, with those in command, right? Yes. You mentioned Sheriff Poggle, a Deputy Inspector Shutter, perhaps. Was he one of the ones you spoke with? Perhaps, I can't recall. Was Investigator Wiegert there? I don't think he was. I think he was obtaining a search warrant. Okay. Lieutenant Herman, maybe? I don't know. All right. But some upper brass, so to speak, in the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, as well as the head of the Calumet. I definitely remember speaking with Sheriff Poggle, and I know I saw Deputy Inspector Shetter there. Okay, and Shetter is with Manitowoc Sheriff's Department, and Poggle is with Calumet? Correct. And so you knew then that a determination had already been made before you arrived that there was a conflict of interest or an appearance of a conflict of interest for Manitowoc County to investigate Mr. Avery? Correct. So for that reason, Calumet had been turned, the lead investigation authority had been turned over to Calumet? Yes. And you, of course, wanted to do everything you could within your knowledge to try and make this investigation a fair one, right? Yes, sir. You didn't want to go into this and set up some kind of investigation that would have an appearance of unfairness, right? I didn't want to set up an investigation that was unfair. Okay. Much less the appearance. And this was a high-profile case. You didn't want the public to think that you were leading an investigation that appeared to be unfair or biased in some way against the gentleman who had sued Manitowoc County. I don't know if I agree with that. I was concerned about finding the truth, not about the press, not about what people thought. And I made my decisions based on that. All right. At any rate, in order to try and ensure that there was a fair investigation, you kind of looked around and made some decisions that a few things had to be changed that hadn't been done yet, right? I'm not sure what you are asking. All right. I will be more specific. I'm sorry. When you arrived at the property at 2:25 p.m., you drove right into the command post and didn't have to sign in or sign out initially, did you? As I answered before, I don't recall. All right, but let me just mark something and show it to you. Exhibit number 142 is then marked for identification. All right, showing you what's marked now as Exhibit 142. Does that look at all familiar to you? Yes, I have seen this. Okay. And can you tell the jury what that is? That's one of the logs I was talking about, a sign-in log, sign-out log, okay, at the scene, okay? And this particular one, I think, actually says, no, this one doesn't. It doesn't say exactly where it is. But does this one appear to be one that was taken up at the intersection of Highway 147 and Avery Road, or does this look like one from somewhere else? This looks like one that was started down by the car crusher, I believe, that staging area down there. Okay, so everybody who came down in that area had to sign in there? I would hope so. Okay, the very first entry is what? DCI agents Hunsader and Fassbender at 2:25 p.m. in, and then some initials. Okay, so this log, in any event, appears to have been started right with your arrival? Yes. And that's good police practice to do that, right? Certainly. You then have a record of everybody who comes and goes, right? Yes. And it has got an exact date and time that someone comes, right? Correct. And that applies to officers? Yes. No matter what their rank? Yes. Even the top dog sheriff has to sign a log like this, right? They should. In order to get past that checkpoint, you would have to sign in. If you were going in the normal way, right? You should, yes. If you were going by that checkpoint, yes. Well, unless you were eluding the checkpoint in some way and coming in at a different location, you would really have to sign in, wouldn't you? Yes. The guard or the officer who's there says, doesn't let anybody by without signing in. Correct. And now you said you have seen this document before. Have you had a chance in the past to go through it with much detail? No, probably not. I'm going to show it to you for a minute. If you could look at it, please. And the court says, is this still Exhibit 142, Mr. Buting? And Attorney Buting says, yes, it is. And then continues with his questioning. All right. Would you make a note of the last page, which is toward the end of the day when people are signing off? You said around 10 o'clock, people were knocking off on, this is the first Friday, November 5th. I'm sorry, Saturday, November 5th? Yes. Most of the investigation detectives were leaving around 10-ish, something like that. 10, 11, sure. Okay. And towards the bottom there, it says, Would you read that line, please? In military time, 2241 hours, Lieutenant Lenk, Detective Remacher, Sergeant Colburn out. And then must be a call number of the officer that was in control of the log 492. Okay. And 2241, what is that in regular civilian? 1041. Okay. PM. All right. So the log shows that Lieutenant Lenk signed out from that checkpoint at 10:41 p.m. on November 5th, correct? Yes. If this is all November 5th, yes. Okay. Well, if you take a minute and look through there and show me where Lieutenant Lenk signed in, if at all. Attorney Kratz says, Judge, I'm going to object. That assumes a fact that's not into evidence, that Lieutenant Lenk was there before 225. Attorney Buting says, well, we're establishing this. Attorney Kratz says, well, if you're establishing that at all, that would be hearsay. If that's what he's using it for, he's assuming a fact that's not in evidence. And the court says, I understand the question to relate simply to whether or not there is a sign-in for Mr. Lenk at some earlier point in time. Attorney Kratz then says, with respect to the court and counsel, then, he should ask that question, Judge, not show me where Lieutenant Lenk signed in if he's on that form. The court says, I will allow you to go into that on redirect. And the Attorney Kratz says, thank you, Judge. And then the witness says, and the question was? And then Attorney Buting continues. The question is, do you see an entry that Lieutenant Lenk signed in anywhere on that log on November 5th? No, sir, I did not. All right. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Feel free. But there's a couple of possibilities of why that might be. One is that Detective Lenk bypassed the checkpoint somehow, right? Yes, that checkpoint. And you have testified already that that is the checkpoint to get in that area, and no one is supposed to come and go without getting checked in, right? In that particular area down by the car crusher, yes. Okay. And the car crusher is the closest checkpoint, one of the closest check areas to the RAV4, right? Correct. Another possibility is that Lieutenant Lenk arrived and was at the scene before that log was even begun, right? Right. Do you know Detective Lenk before this investigation? No. So did you know him by sight at all before this investigation? Would you be able to recognize him if he showed up at Avery Salvage? No, I don't believe so. Okay. Do you know whether you saw this person, now known as Lieutenant Lenk, at the Avery Salvage when you arrived at about 2 o'clock? I don't recall. Okay. So you have no recollection of seeing him arrive yourself. No recollection. Or recollection of him even being there when you arrived? Correct. Okay. By the way, if I may divert for just a second, you said when you talked about putting together some teams, you said that you had actually trained certain individuals in one of these evidence processing teams from Manitowoc, a couple of them. Would you just tell me who the names of those people? Detective Remacher and Sergeant Colburn. Okay. Not in evidence collection. Not in evidence collection? No. So whatever personal knowledge that you had about their training had nothing to do with their skill in that specific field of collecting evidence? Correct. Okay. When you came into this case, I assume you were not considering the possibility that some law enforcement officer would actually plant evidence against Mr. Avery. Were you? No. Have you ever encountered a case where you had to deal with that issue? I worked in public corruption for 12 years with white-collar crime and planting evidence. I don't believe I have ever had a police officer do that. All right. So when you came to the scene, your focus was not on making sure that no police officer would do something that bad, like plant evidence, right? That wasn't part of your focus when you arrived. Certainly. Okay. Attorney Buting then says, I'm sorry, counsel, could we put up Exhibit 86 again, our most common exhibit so far? And then he continues his questioning. All right. Could you show us again where this checkpoint area was, or strike that? Show me where, when you drove down to the RAV4 area or the southeast corner of that property, show me where you parked, or did you drive or walk? I'm sorry. I believe the first time I went down there, I drove. Okay. And show me about where you parked. Could you maybe zoom it up one level? Okay. That's good. I believe it was probably right in this area, right here, kind of right next to the crusher. Like, here's the crusher, right? I can't remember exactly, but I would say a little south of the crusher, probably be just not halfway in between that pond area and the crusher, but further south of the crusher a bit. Well, did you do a report that sort of summarized your involvement during that week? Yes. I'm not going to mark this right now unless we later need it, but for the record, is this one of your reports? Yes, it is. It's a DCI report, report number 180, case file 051776. Okay. And this is a report that you prepared when? Back in November of 2005? Report date 12/9/05. Okay. But closer in time to the events than we are today, obviously? Certainly. I want you to take a moment and read this to yourself, this paragraph to yourself, and see if that refreshes your recollection about where you parked. Okay? Okay? I will leave it here in case we need it again, but does that help refresh your recollection a little bit? It does. It's similar to what I said, where it says just west of the crusher, right? Near and just west of the crusher. So in this area, but now you're thinking maybe a little bit further down here? Maybe not. I thought I was a little further south to the crusher when I look at the pictures. Whether it was just west of the crusher, I'm not sure. It may have been. In any event, from the crusher, from where you parked, would be at least somewhat closer to the location of the RAV4 than it would be if you were all the way at the crusher itself by however many feet you parked away. Yes, okay. And from that distance, you indicated you were still quite a distance away, right? Yes. And so much so that you pulled out some binoculars to be able to view the RAV4 from that distance? I didn't pull out some binoculars. I think someone at the scene had some and they let me use them. Okay. Well, at this time, you think it was 2:25. So your understanding was that the first officers arrived at 11? I believe so. And this was, as you described it, at that point, I think you said this on direct, this RAV4 was, at that point, the major piece of evidence on this property that you knew of? Yes, that was it. That's the focus. That's the missing woman's car. Yes, right? Yes. And when you arrived up there, having already been briefed at the command post, you knew about this issue with the appearance of a conflict for Manitowoc County, right? Correct. And then, yet, you discovered that it wasn't until 3 o'clock, approximately, that a Calumet deputy took over responsibility for trying to secure that major piece of evidence. I don't know that for sure as I sit here, but it may have been. Well, maybe, just so the record is clear, you have one advantage of being a witness here today in that you haven't been sequestered, right? Correct. You have been able to sit here at the trial along with Mr. or Investigator Wiegert and hear most of the testimony, right? Correct. And you heard, I think it was with Sergeant Orth, testimony that there was at 3:04 p.m., or maybe it was Lieutenant Herman, I may be mistaken, that it was 3:04 p.m. that Manitowoc Deputy Sheriff Cummings transferred responsibility for security of that vehicle to a Calumet County deputy. I'm not disputing it. I just don't independently recall that bit of testimony. You don't recall the time or you don't recall the testimony. When he said what time he turned it over. So you wouldn't disagree with me that it was 3 o'clock? I have no reason to. Okay. So did it cause you concern that for 4 hours, the major piece of evidence in this case was under the control of the very department that had already been determined to have a conflict of interest in this case? Attorney Kratzen says, objection, Judge. I think it's a mischaracterization. The word conflict is in fact a mischaracterization. Attorney Buting says, I will rephrase it. I know what counsel is talking about. And then continues. Did it cause you concern that for 4 hours, the major piece of evidence in this case was under the control and security of the one department that itself determined to have an appearance of a conflict of interest? No, it didn't. I was not involved in that decision-making. I knew that officers were on that scene protecting that scene. You weren't involved in that decision-making at all because that took place before you got there? Correct. Okay. And the fact you were trying to shape things up a bit and make sure that logs were taken and all of that when you arrived, I suggested a log be kept. Okay. So it didn't concern you that there was going to be an appearance that the fox was guarding the hen house, so to speak. Is that right? Absolutely not. Okay. Well, did you suggest that Manitowoc back off and that the Calumet deputy take over? Was that part of your decision? I don't believe so. It happened, but I don't believe that was specifically my decision. So it was just coincidental that it happened around the time you arrived? Probably, yes. All right. Now, at that point, you were already designated as co-leader? No, I don't think so. I think that happened when Detective Wiegert got back, and I can't remember when exactly, if it was after Brutus alerted or before, but we were having a briefing at the command center and a determination was made, and we were asked to do that. Okay. So that's all right. That's fine. So that was after Investigator Wiegert came back with the search warrant? Yes. And that was about 3:35, I believe, right? I believe so, 3:25, 3:35. And it was even later than that, I believe. The designation was later than that? Yes. Sure, I understand. So then, just so we're clear, when you got there, the leader of the investigation, Investigator Wiegert, was not present on the property? He was not present. I don't even know if he was the leader or not, but he was not present. And there were no prosecutors present? When I got there, I can't remember. I know they were there at some time. I just can't remember if they were there then. Well, if you look at Exhibit 142, see if that refreshes your recollection as to when any of the district attorneys involved returned to the property. I see an indication at what appears to be 3:32 p.m. 3:32? 3:32 p.m. Manitowoc County District Attorney and Assistant District Attorney on the scene. That is not saying whether they were there earlier than 2:25 or not. Okay. What about Mr. Kratz or his assistant? 4:03 p.m., Assistant District Attorney from Calumet County, Jeff Froelich. And then there's an entry at 4:17 for both district attorneys returned. All right. That's good enough for now, I guess. So during that period of time then, until Investigator Wiegert came back with a search warrant, or until the district attorneys came, did you view yourself as sort of an agent in control or not? You were still an outsider, so to speak? Yes, I did not view myself as an agent in control of anything. Okay, that's fine. At some point, though, that did happen. And Sheriff Poggle, I believe it was, requested you to be a co-leader? Probably, yes. And then you mentioned that you had some meetings and discussions about trying to develop some kind of a search plan? Yes. And the first thing you did was this. You called it a sweep of all the properties, right? Correct. And like you said, this was a missing person case still. But you came into this thinking something more, didn't you? Yes. Based on what I knew at the time, plus, to me, just good practice to do that. Okay. Something more, even including a homicide, right? True. And in fact, the search warrant applications that were prepared told the court they were looking for evidence, including evidence of a possible homicide, right? Correct. And that took place even before you got to the scene? Yes. Okay. And so in part because of that, I believe you testified on direct that you wanted to make sure that you didn't miss anything in this investigation, that it could be a lot more than just a missing person case. It could be homicide. So you wanted to make sure that nobody missed anything, right? You tried to do that as a concept to go in with that mentality. All right. Let me go through some of these searches briefly with you. If I told you that on November 5th at 3:48 p.m., the first entry was made to Mr. Avery's trailer for this sweep type search, does that fit with your recollection? That sounds right. Detective Remacher and Deputy Steyer? Yes. Two of them went in. It was a quick 10 minutes in and out of the building, looking to see if there was a live person there. Teresa, right? Yes. And then they went on to other buildings and, doors were being kicked in, if necessary, to get in because you were looking for, hopefully, still a live person. Yes. There were multiple teams, not just that one team, I think. Okay. And then immediately after they left Mr. Avery's residence, the trailer, the same team immediately went right into the detached garage sitting next to his trailer as well. I think so, yes. Again, a quick entry, look around to see if there's anybody there, alive or otherwise. Yes. But in neither instance was anything seized. Not that I know of. Okay. And then you did mention that I think the next level of searches, sort of right after the sweep, and the sweep was also to make sure that there's nobody there that could harm the officers, some gunman, armed gunman, or something like that, right? For our protection, yes. That's routine procedure? Correct. Okay. But the next level of search after that was these dogs. You said there were like 9 cadaver or human remains type dogs. A combination of human remains, mixed and live. So all different kinds of dogs, but search dogs? Yes. And they started going through everything, right? As quickly as they could. Primarily the vehicles in the salvage yard. Okay. And we heard about this indication or alert that this dog Brutus did in the bathroom of Mr. Avery's trailer, right? Yes. You heard that testimony today? Yes. But you were aware that there were other alerts, many alerts all over that property, right? There were other alerts, yes, including right at the front door of Chuck Avery's trailer residence, right? Correct. Now, Chuck Avery, Mr. Avery's brother, also lived on the property, right? Yes. And in fact, his trailer is the closest trailer to the RAV4 that was discovered, closest residence, right? And then Attorney Buting says, maybe if you could zoom out one. Yes. And then Attorney Buting continues, degree, please, counsel. Could you point where Chuck Avery's residence was on there or is? I will have to squint a little bit here, but I think it's right there. Okay. And there were other hits, other buildings and cars and kind of all over the place initially, right? Yes. So it's not like Stephen Avery's bathroom where he shaves is the only place that any dog alerted on that 40-acre property. Yes, sir, that's correct. All right, okay. Then you broke up into teams. Well, actually, let me go back for just a minute a number of times. Let me just clarify that. A number of times you said this was a general search plan you were trying to put together at that stage, right? Beginning with the sweeps? Yeah, the whole plan from when you got there. Trying to put a plan together, certainly, yes. And that it was fluid, that it adjusted based on information, new information you might get or not get, right? Throughout the entire time we had that property, yes. Okay. Well, I think you said on direct, though, that you weren't, when you set up that very first plan, that you really weren't sure what you were searching for. We had a search warrant that indicated items that we were searching for. Right. And in that search warrant, I mean, you took us off a little with an example of a case where some pathologist told you maybe look for a knife with a serrated blade or something, right? Correct. In this case, though, you didn't have that kind of information yet. That's right. You said you were looking at this investigation already as a homicide, potentially? Yes. And your search warrant told you to look for any kind of instrumentologies that could cause a homicide, including knives, right? Yes. Firearms, right? Yes. Whatever else could be used, items to bludgeon someone, anything like that, right? Correct. So the officers did know to look for all those kinds of items, at least. They should have, yes. All right. So then after the first entries, after the very first brief sweep of Mr. Avery's trailer, you then sat down to put together a team who could actually start collecting evidence, search and collect evidence, not just do these sweeps. Yes. And again, I'm assuming that foremost in your mind was that you wanted to make sure that this was going to be a fair investigation and a fair search of anyone's property on that 40-acre parcel, right? Of course. And so you would not knowingly have assigned officers to certain duties if you had known that they might be in a situation where there's an appearance of a conflict of interest, right? Again, I have trouble with the word appearance. If there's a definite conflict of interest, that would be a concern of mine. All right. Well, let me ask it this way, sir. Did you know on that day, November 5th, when you are putting this team of searchers together, did you know that Lieutenant Lenk had just been deposed as a witness in Mr. Avery's civil lawsuit just 3 weeks earlier? No, I didn't. Did you know that Sergeant Andrew Colburn, had also been deposed as a witness just 3 weeks earlier? No, I didn't. And neither Sergeant Colburn nor Lieutenant Lenk told you that fact, did they? Not to my recollection, no. As a matter of fact, when did you first learn that they had been deposed? Was it at my behest? It may have been. I don't know if I knew before then, at a hearing. A hearing in August? That may have been. That was the first time anybody told you, hey, these guys were deposed as witnesses with Mr. Avery sitting right there. I don't remember if that was the first time. All right, but surely you didn't know it anyway on November 5th? Correct. And if you had known that these two officers who you were assigning to go into Mr. Avery's residence, a person of interest, if you had known that those two officers had been deposed as witnesses in that civil case, you would not have assigned them to that duty, would you? That's not correct. Based on what I know now, I'm asking your knowledge then. Are you telling me that you would have, even if they had told you, and if you had known that they were witnesses in that civil case, you would still have assigned Lenk and Colburn to the evidence team that went into Mr. Avery's residence? Number one, I needed evidence technicians. Number two, I would have asked, Attorney Buting says, Your Honor. And then Fassbender continues to answer them what it related to. And then Attorney Buting says, this is a yes or no answer. He can explain it on redirect. The court says, that's correct. It is a yes or no answer. And then he continues answering. Based on, I guess repeat the question again. I'm saying yes. You are saying that even if you had known that Lenk and Colburn had been witnesses in the civil lawsuit 3 weeks earlier, deposed in Mr. Avery's civil lawsuit, you would have still assigned them to go search Mr. Avery's residence? There's more to the answer. You want yes, I will tell you yes right now. But there's more to that answer. All right, well, let me talk about what your resources were. You, by that time, had other people who could go in that Mr. Avery's residence and search, didn't you? We were looking for trained evidence technicians, and we put a team together with them. I don't know of any other people that I would have used for that. Well, you had another team, didn't you? You had another team search other areas, other buildings on that property. On Saturday, no. The crime lab was there, but they were busy with the vehicle. All right. You had the property for a week? Yes. You went in and out of this trailer. We'll get into how many times during that week. There would have been no reason for you to rush to search Mr. Avery's trailer without waiting a few more moments for the crime lab specialist to come and search it on Saturday or another day. Saturday, or even wait until another day. I mean, you already knew that Teresa wasn't inside. I had a capable and qualified team that could go in there and do the job. All right. I sent them in there. And there were certainly other buildings on that property where other people resided that did not have a civil lawsuit that required the testimony at a deposition of Mr. Lenk and Mr. Colburn, right? Yes. Chuck Avery. Let's just look at him for a second. It's another residence where the dog alerted, right? Yes. Could have sent Lenk and Colburn in there and have someone else go into Mr. Avery's residence too. Again, make sure that there's no appearance of some funny business going on. Saturday? Yes. A possibility. I'm looking at other bits of information also when I'm determining where we're sending in our first team. Well, you sent the first team to Mr. Avery's because you said that was the obvious place to start, based on several reasons. All right, let's look at those a little bit. I think right before that, if I recall, you said that Mr. Avery was not the only person being investigated. Correct. But you felt he was the most obvious place to start. I had to pick a place to start. The person who last saw that person alive was a pretty logical place to start. But you have done many homicide investigations over the years, right? That depends on what you term as many. I'm not going to say I have done hundreds of homicide investigations. But you have done enough. You know about certain patterns. For instance, often the most obvious suspect in a homicide is a spouse. You look at the spouse, right? Yes, the people we love the most. Or you look at a boyfriend or an ex-boyfriend, don't you? Yes. Or how about a roommate? Yes. How about a roommate who doesn't report the victim missing for 3, almost 4 days? Yes. That would be somebody you'd want to investigate. That's a possible area to look at. That would be somebody you want to ask for an alibi. Attorney Kratz then says, Judge, I'm going to interpose an objection. If counsel really wants to get into a true motive, I think this going to require advance rulings. I would like to either be heard outside the presence of the jury, or I would object to this line of questioning as it deals directly with and this part evidently was inaudible. And the court says, all right, the court is going to excuse the jurors for a few minutes. So the jurors leave. They are currently not present. And the court says, you may be seated. Attorney Kratz says, if I may be heard, Judge. And the court says, yes. Attorney Kratz says, thank you, Your Honor. The defense has now introduced into this trial motive, that is, asking this officer why what Mr. Buting has now identified as several individuals who might have an obvious motive to kill Ms. Halbach. The state, as this court knows, earlier in this case, offered specific evidence. It's called other acts evidence to prove Mr. Avery's motive. Now that the defense has opened the door, now that the defense has suggested that other people have motive, the inferences that Mr. Avery does not, that is a reasonable inference for the jury to draw based upon Mr. Buting's questioning of this witness. I am at this time then, Judge, going to ask the court revisit or at least allow additional argument on the issue of other acts evidence. If Mr. Buting, who now believes that motive is at issue, Mr. Buting and the defense now believes that motive should be considered by this jury as part of the case, and at least by the inference that Mr. Avery does not have a motive, the state would, once again, reoffer those items, which we specifically offered in pretrial attempts to address Mr. Avery's motive directly. This court has heard through our opening statement that we were not going to raise motive as an issue, that we had stayed away because of the court's previous ruling on this entire issue. But now that Mr. Buting and now that the defense has raised the issue of motive, I'm going to ask the court revisit those issues. The court then says, Mr. Buting, and Attorney Buting says, Judge, I have done nothing of the sort. What we're doing here is cross-examination of this officer who testified that Mr. Avery was the obvious choice of where to start the investigation. All we're talking about is what's going through his mind at that day, that time, in terms of where to allocate his resources. And I'm demonstrating his bias towards Mr. Avery and focus on Mr. Avery to the exclusion of others. That's all this is going into. There's no motive otherwise being introduced. The court then says, all right, I will make a couple of comments. First of all, the court, by denying the state's other acts motion, did not prohibit the state from introducing any evidence relating to motive. Rather, the court simply denied the particular mechanisms, if you will, that were proposed by the state for other reasons related to the law involving the admission of other acts evidence. With respect to the questions posed by the defense at this point, they don't involve an offer of extrinsic evidence and therefore, at least at this point, do not raise a Denny issue. The court is well aware of its prior ruling, and I will keep my ears open in the event that happens. But I don't believe it's happened to this point. The focus of the questioning, as I understand it to this point, rather goes to decisions that the officer made in the investigation of this matter and other parts of investigation that could have been followed. So I'm going to overrule the objection at this point. If the state believes it's going too far, again, I will reconsider it again. But I'm only ruling on what I heard to this point. You can bring the jury back in. Okay, so let's pause here because this part, it's easy to miss unless you know what's really going on in that courtroom. So Kratz asked to have the jury step out because what he really wanted was to bring back in all of this ugly stuff from Stephen Avery's past. And this ugly stuff is also called other acts evidence. This was a document that was filed even before the trial began. And I've read through those. And what the state actually wanted to show the jury. These were things like, and this is not easy to hear, animal cruelty, threats to kill his ex-wife, alleged assaults, even disturbing claims of sexual misconduct. And Kratz wanted the jury to see this. And he wanted them to think, this is who Stephen Avery is. Of course he did it. But here's the thing. Past bad behavior doesn't automatically equal future behavior. Can you imagine? And that's exactly why the court shut most of it down before the trial even started. The judge said it either wasn't relevant, it wasn't recent, or it was so prejudicial that it would derail the whole trial. But Kratz saw this opening because Buting, the defense attorney, started questioning this cop about his tunnel vision. Why Avery? Why not anyone else? And that was all it took for Kratz to try and shove this door back open. But the judge says, hey, hold up. Look, I didn't ban the state from talking about motive in general. I just said that they couldn't use these specific other acts to do it because of how the law works. And then he addressed something called a Denny issue. And I know we've talked about this before in past episodes, but it's been a while. This is when the defense tries to blame someone else for the murder. But to do that legally, you've got to show motive, opportunity, and a clear link to the crime. Buting hasn't done that and hadn't done that. He wasn't saying, here's who did it. He was saying, here's why this cop ignored other possibilities. And that's fair game. So the judge said to Kratz, he's like, nope, door's still closed. And unless I hear something that crosses a legal line, it stays that way. And I'll be honest, this part kind of pissed me off because Kratz wasn't trying to prove what happened to Teresa. He was trying to put the jury on this emotional roller coaster, and he wanted them to hate Stephen Avery. He wanted them to see Stephen not just as a man on trial, but as this monster. And that's not how justice is supposed to work. And one more thing, this isn't in the transcript, but it matters. Stephen's IQ is reportedly around 70. That's right on the edge of intellectual disability. That means he likely struggles with comprehension, communication, and impulse control. Now, I'm not saying it proves guilt or innocence, but it does raise some serious questions about how he was treated, how he was questioned, and how easily he could be misunderstood or manipulated, much like his nephew, Brendan, when we get to his trial. So let's get back to the trial. So the jury comes back in, they're now present, and the court says, you may be seated. Mr. Buting, you may resume. And Mr. Buting, Attorney Buting, says thank you. And he continues. I believe we left off with you saying, yes, you would certainly like to investigate it. These are the people you were talking about, the roommate or ex-boyfriend. That is an avenue that would be approached absent other circumstances. All right. And wouldn't you also want to, so you don't miss anything, as you said, investigate an employer who doesn't report an employee missing for 3 days? In relation to the employer reporting related to this case? Yeah, this case. That would be something you would look into possibly. Yes. All right. But at any rate, you decided that the first place you would start would be Mr. Avery's trailer, residence. Based on information that I had, yes. All right. And you put together, actually, a team of 4 officers, correct? A team of 4 officers was put together, yes. Whether I did it specifically, I don't recall. 3 of those 4 officers are Manitowoc Sheriff's Department employees, right? 2 investigators and 1 officer, or sergeant, yes. And they are Lieutenant Lenk, Sergeant Colburn, and Detective Remacher, yes. And then you also had a Calumet Sergeant Tyson, yes, as part of that team. And that team entered Mr. Avery's residence at 7:30 p.m. on November 5th, Saturday, yes. And they didn't leave until 10:05 p.m. That's correct. Those 4 officers searching Mr. Avery's residence for over 2.5 hours? Yes. Both sides are having trouble with the electronics in this courtroom, I'm afraid. Let me try something else. We'll see if I can put on one of these slide exhibits. I'm showing you what's Exhibit 102, I think. Yes. We heard testimony about this animation before, right? That's correct. and this is accurate, I guess, to the inch or half inch or something like that. Is that what we heard? Attorney Buting says, zoom out just a bit. There we go. And then continues. This is the sum total. And then Attorney Buting again says, zoom out one little bit to show the whole. And then he continues. This is the sum total of residences that you had 4 officers in for 2.5 hours on the evening of November 5th, correct? Yes. And at that time, they were looking for any evidence, including evidence of a possible homicide, right? Yes, sir. They were looking for blood, right? Yes. Certainly any indication, maybe, that Teresa Halbach had been in that residence? Correct. It's a rather small area to search as residences go, don't you think? I suppose, yes. And they seized 50-some items on that occasion, right? I don't know how many items they seized on that occasion. And from your knowledge of the investigation later, none of those items were in any way linked to Miss Halbach, were they? That's probably true. I'm not positive. Okay. We'll follow through with that in a minute. And then they left and quit for the night. And the next day, they went to search Mr. Avery's garage. Is that right? Yes. Makeup of the team was a little different, though, I think. I'm sorry, you're right. It was Lieutenant Lenk, Sergeant Colburn, Remaker, the same 3 Manitowoc officers, right? Correct. At this time with Deputy Kurcharski, I believe. Is that the way you pronounce it? From Calumet? Yes. So 4 more officers this time searching this one-room garage. Is that right? Yes. For 1 hour and 47 minutes. Does that sound right? I don't know. Sounds right. If I told you that they entered at 8 a.m. and left at 9:47 a.m. on November 6th, Sunday morning, would you disagree with that? Okay, Christine here, I just, as you know, interject my thoughts as I'm reading through these. So we all know, right, that this garage is chock full of things. I mean, it almost looks like a hoarder's garage, right? But here's the thing, is that they were in Stephen's trailer for, how long did they say? I have to go back. 2.5 hours around, and I think he said there were 4 of them, right? So 4 officers searching Stephen Avery's trailer for 2.5 hours. And then the next day they go over to the garage, which is just, like I said, chock full of, just about everything. Again, very, very hoarder looking. I mean, everything's in there. Snowmobiles, a motorcycle, a car, there's tools, it's just full of all this stuff. And they only take 1 hour and 47 minutes in this garage. The house wasn't like that. The house wasn't like a hoarder area. Why would the house take so much longer than this garage? Anyway, let's continue. We left off with the questioning of, if I told you they entered at 8 a.m. and left at 9:47 a.m. on November 6th, Sunday morning, would you disagree with that? And he says, no, I wouldn't. You also mentioned that later that day, on Sunday, after briefing with you, you determined that the officers had seen a couple of firearms in Mr. Avery's residence, and you wanted to send them back in to retrieve those items, right? They talked about several items, and yes, we did want to. So the same team of four officers, Remaker, Lenk, Colburn, and Kucharski, went back into Mr. Avery's residence at 12:25 p.m. on November 6th and left at 12:48 p.m. Would you disagree with that? No, I wouldn't. So 23 minutes in his residence. Again, right? Correct. That's now the fourth entry to Mr. Avery's trailer. Yes, sir. By law enforcement officers? Correct. And then later that evening, Sunday evening, Attorney Buting then says, you can put the trailer back on. And then continues. Later that evening, you had a team from the crime lab go back into Mr. Avery's residence, the fifth entry, right? Yes. Okay. And that's when you said that they came in with alternate light sources and things of that nature to try and see if there might be other, blood stains or something like that might have been missed. That night, they were looking for blood patterns. It's a different night that they used the luminol. And they indicated a few areas that they thought your officers should at least collect. Maybe they are important, maybe they are not. Correct. But they didn't themselves collect it. They left it for your officers? To my knowledge, yes. And then you said the next day, which would have been Monday, November 7th, Lieutenant Lenk and Sergeant Colburn and Sergeant Tyson went back into Mr. Avery's residence again for the computer to take the serial number off the computer. If I told you that they were in for 7 minutes at 9:57 a.m. to 10:04 a.m., would that fit with your recollection? Yes. Now, that's now the 6th entry? Yes. By law enforcement to Mr. Avery's residence, right? Yes. The following day, the team comes in a little bit smaller. At this time, it's just Lieutenant Lenk and Sergeant Colburn and Deputy Kucharski, right? Yes. This is Tuesday morning, November 8th. If I told you then that they entered at 8:25 a.m. and left at 12:18 p.m., would that fit with your recollection? 8:25, I'm not sure about when they left. All right. And that was the 7th entry to Mr. Avery's residence. And that's the entry that this key was supposedly discovered by Lieutenant Lenk, right? Yes, sir. That had been missed in 6 other entries, correct? Yes. And holy shit, what are they doing in there for 4 hours? I mean, it's not like they're searching the entire 40-acre property. They're searching within one trailer. Anyway, and we will hear how it was discovered and how obvious it was later. I'm not going to ask you about that because you weren't present for the discovery of the key, were you? That's correct. You arrived and they said, hey, we have got this key. It's a Toyota key. And you rushed to, strike that, you came immediately to take a look at the key and see whether or not something else should be done with it, right? What should be done with it? Yes. Okay. And you mentioned, let's send it to the crime lab and see if it will start the ignition of the Halbach vehicle. That's right. And then I'm just going to go through this quickly. On November 9th, you sent Lieutenant Lenk, Sergeant Colburn, and Calumet Deputy Wendling back into Mr. Avery's residence again, looking for a garage door opener. I think you said it was, or some things like that. Yes, garage door opener. Because what was it? There was a garage door opener found in Teresa Halbach's RAV4. Yes. And there was some concern that maybe that was the killer's, right? That was a thought. And so we looked around the property, not just Stephen's residence, to see if we could locate whether they were. In fact, we actually brought that thing up, I think the next day or the day after, to see if it opened any garage door. And it turned out to open Teresa's own garage door. Yes. So it was unrelated to the crime? Yes. And then, again, later on November 9th, Lenk and Colburn and Wendling went back in for 10 minutes from 11:40 to 11:51, looking for some missing tool. Does that ring a bell? That I don't recall. They went in a garage. Okay. That was November 8th when they were there looking for a garage. I'm sorry. They were looking for a tool that was missing from a kit that was in Teresa Halbach's car, right? Right. That was, my recollection is that kind of ran together. This tool was discovered earlier, and that was kind of ongoing. And they went in Stephen's trailer to look for the garage door opener and saw some pair of women's gloves, I believe. Then they went into the garages. I think they went into Barb's in her garage to look for this tool. Okay, so let me just finish up with the residence first and then go back to the garage. You do recall, though, that there was an entry, another entry, which would now be the 9th entry to Mr. Avery's residence on November 9th. November 9th being Wednesday? Yes. And that was the garage door opener? Yes. Okay. And then you obtained a second warrant, right? Yes. And then thereafter, Mr. Avery's residence was again entered 3 more times on November 12th for 2 hours and 4 minutes by Trooper Austin to take measurements for these helpful animated computer diagrams, right? Yes. And again on November 12th, this time yourself entering briefly, looking for some kind of document, right? I think myself and 2 of the other investigators looking for some documents. Yes. And then I think you did one more quick run through at 9:30 on November 12th, shortly before the property was re-released to the Averys, right? Yes. Generally, you do a final sweep. I count 12 entries to Mr. Avery's trailer during that week by law enforcement. Would you disagree with that? No. Okay. Going back to the garage, I'm not sure. I think I said that after that there was the first sweep entry of the garage, right? Yes, on the 5th. And then the next morning, when the 4 officers spent almost 2 hours in that little garage on November 6th, right? Yes. And then there was also one looking for the tool on November 8th. Yes, lasted about 24 minutes. Would you agree with that? I'm not sure if that was the 8th or the 9th. One of those 2 days. I thought it was the 9th when they were looking for that emergency roadside tool. Okay. And it wasn't found, right? They found a bag that had tools like that in it on a samurai in there, but did not ultimately match up to what we were looking for. And then, without belaboring the point here too much, the garage, Mr. Avery's garage, was entered again on November 9th for 19 minutes, November 10th, briefly, looking for a hacksaw blade. Do you remember that? Yes, I believe Agent Sturdivant had done that. And on November 12th, one final time before you released the property? Yes. So I count 6 entries to his garage by law enforcement during that week. Would you agree with that? 5 or 6. I wasn't counting along. All right. Attorney Buting then says, Judge, do you want to take an afternoon break? Might be a good time. The court says, all right, we'll take our afternoon break at this time. Resume at 5 minutes to 3. And we, right now, are going to end this episode of the Avery trial and pick back up in the next episode. Before we close, I want to circle back to something that Fassbender said that just does not sit right with me. And I don't know if you caught this too. He defended sending Manitowoc County officers, specifically Lenk and Colburn, into Stephen Avery's trailer during that critical early search. And his excuse was that he said that the crime lab was already on site, but that they were too busy processing the RAV4. But hang on. His own testimony earlier said the decision was made not to process the RAV4 at the scene. They were worried about weather, so they had it towed to a lab in an enclosed, controlled vehicle, towing vehicle, so that they could take it into their lab, which was also enclosed and controlled, right? So if they weren't processing the RAV4 on the property, what exactly was the crime lab doing that made it so necessary to send in 2 officers that Avery was suing? That, my friends, is a red flag. It's the kind of detail that makes you wonder which version is actually the truth. This episode also kind of showed us how sloppy or calculated, depending on how you look at it, this investigation might have been. Because when you start counting the number of times that officers entered Stephen Avery's trailer or his garage, it stops feeling like an investigation and starts looking like some kind of siege. There were 12 separate entries into his trailer, 6 into the garage. Over the course of a week, with overlapping teams, and with, yes, the same Manitowoc officers at the center of Avery's civil lawsuit, repeatedly being sent back in to his trailer and to his garage. And what did they find in those early entries? Nothing. I mean, his trailer is not that big, right? There was no blood, no DNA, no sign of Teresa, until suddenly they did. They found this car key sitting in plain view on day 4, after several trained officers supposedly just missed it. Just sit with that for a minute. Either they were incredibly inept at their job, or someone put it there. That's really the only 2 plausible explanations. And then we have Kratz trying to barge in with Avery's past. And when it came to the whole motive thing, the judge says no, because this trial isn't supposed to be about who Avery was in 1985 or even prior to 1985. It's about what happened to Teresa in 2005. In the next episode, we continue with the defense questioning of Fassbender, which actually, believe it or not, doesn't take the rest of the day. There's actually 2 witnesses after him, but their testimony looks to be pretty short. And for those who have asked, I will continue with the Zellner information, Stephen's post-conviction attorney, as soon as there's information to include. The last few witnesses didn't have anything in the Zellner files, but Fassbender definitely does. So as soon as we're done with his testimony, you'll hear more about what she filed. Thanks so much, everyone. I'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, be sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss an update. We'll talk really soon. Bye for now.